We had the opportunity to meet with Günter Schröder, a German scholar and expert on Horn of Africa matters. He has been following the events in the Horn of Africa since September 1965. He has widely traveled in the region, lived with the EPLF, TPLF and OLF in the 1980s and supported their struggle against the Derg for Eritrean independence. From 1983 until 1991, he worked with Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees in Germany. After 1991 until 2000, he engaged in development-related activities in Ethiopia. In 2001, Schroeder did research and developmental consultancies in Eritrea until 2008. Moreover, since 1978, he has been writing expert opinions for asylum cases of Eritrean and Ethiopian refugees. Furthermore, Schroeder has published various books and articles on Horn of Africa and refugee issues. In addition, he has given numerous lectures on Eritrean and Ethiopian issues in many European countries, as in Germany and also in the USA. We had the pleasure of engaging in a long conversation with Schroeder. We had the opportunity to grasp a glance of his broad knowledge in the matter of the long Eritrean liberation struggle, the Eritrean history in general, and other developments in the Horn of Africa.
I would like to stress that the presentation which I gave here is a preliminary one. It needs further refinement, and also in the following years, following months and years, I will try to follow up developments in Eritrea to refine the analysis and the presentation in these various crucial areas of development for Eritrea. And hopefully this presentation, together with the previous interview, will contribute to a better understanding of certain historical and present issues of Eritrea for the younger generations of Eritreans who hopefully will view these materials. It is very difficult to give a clear picture of the current situation in Eritrea. On the one side, one has the official presentation of the Eritrean government, which gives a very positive and optimistic picture of what is happening in Eritrea. On the other side, one has presentations, opinions of Eritrean refugees and opposition organizations, which depict Eritrea as being practically a failed state and liable to fall apart if no remedies are undertaken. Mostly the difficulty of achieving a clear idea of what is the situation inside Eritrea is due to the overall and very pronounced secrecy of the government and its institutions. Since 1991, no official census has ever been taken in Eritrea. There is therefore no clear idea about the size of the Eritrean population, the ethnic composition, the religious composition. There is no functioning central statistical office which regularly publishes economic and social educational indicators which would be accessible to the public and also the international public. Therefore, one has to rely on scattered references, scattered numbers found in the Eritrean media, state-controlled media. There are no other media in Eritrea. And reports of international agencies which were allowed to conduct as a surveys and other activities inside Eritrea. The picture which emerges from these as a scattered and as a fragmentary sources is far from complete, but at least allows to identify the certain areas where the Eritrean state totally failed to achieve its own goals. Particularly due to this secrecy and lack of reliable data, it is very difficult to assess what has been the impact of the ongoing emigration from Eritrea on the Eritrean society, on the Eritrean as economy, on the Eritrean educational system. There are no reliable data because all data pertaining to national service are classified on the current situation of the national service, how many people are in national service, what is the average duration of people in national service, what is the gender as a relation among the national service people and related as issues. The following presentation tries to answer some of these questions based on the scattered data and references which I could gather from official sources, but also using information obtained from Eritrean as refugees which were interviewed in Sudan and in Ethiopia. The average national population growth was around 12%. The central region experienced a growth of 20%, which shows that more and more Eritreans migrate to Asmara, which is the economic and social hub of Eritrea, where public services are much better than in smaller towns throughout the country. However, the northern Red Sea region and the southern Red Sea region experienced tremendous population losses. The northern Red Sea region lost about 30% of its population, and from the information collected in Sudan from Eritrean Muslim refugees, it seems that a majority of the Tigray living in northern Red Sea have actually emigrated over the last decade to Sudan, where they merged with a Tigray population living in northeastern Sudan. Most of them did not register as refugees there. Partly the population loss through the emigration of the Tigray was offset by the immigration of Tigrinya speakers in the highland, particularly in the areas of the Massawa and She'eb. Southern Red Sea experienced the population loss of close to 20%, which also conforms with the information collected among Eritrean Afar refugees. In Ethiopia, it seems that more than 60% of the Eritrean Afar are today living as refugees inside Ethiopia. Also here, the population loss caused by the emigration of the Afar had been partially offset by major immigration of Tigrinya speakers from the highland. The city of Assab, whose pre-war population of above 70,000 had shrunk down to 15,000 after the flight and deportation of Ethiopians living in Assab, has now risen again to about 25,000, the majority of which are Tigrinya speakers. The indigenous Afar, which had always been a minority in Assab, even under Ethiopian rule and in the early years of Eritrean independence, continue to be a small minority in the urban area of Assab. In line with that also, the mayor of Assab and the mayor of Massawa and the regional governor in northern Red Sea until recently were Tigrinya speakers, not from the local indigenous population. The largest deviation from the average population growth is found in the Gashbaka zone, in the Gashbaka region, which experienced a population growth of 36%, nearly 3 times the national average. That indicates that between 2000 and 2016 there had been a major immigration of highlanders into Gashbaka. There were subsequent large settlement schemes for highlanders as implemented in the lowlands of Gashbaka. Also returning refugees from Sudan in the years 2002-2005 were in their majority settled in Gashbaka. That naturally has major implications, this population development in northern Red Sea, in southern Red Sea, and in Gashbaka, and partly also in parts of Ansaba. The immigration of highlanders and the emigration of the indigenous population abroad has resulted in major shifts in the ethno-demographic balance. In some areas in Gashbaka and in northern Red Sea and southern Red Sea, the indigenous population is now a minority in comparison with the immigrating the Tigrinya speakers. This has far-reaching implications also for the social stability. There is growing friction between the indigenous population and immigrants, and it has political implications because political representatives of the native population of these areas resent what they consider the immigration, the invasion of the highlanders, and they try to mobilize their people against this immigration. Unfortunately, the local people in these areas do not have any political power which would allow them to counteract this immigration as a policy and trends. Another area where the large-scale flight has had a major impact on the population structure is gender. In a normal society, the ratio between male and female is 50-50, with only slight variations, 49.8 to 50.2, or vice versa. In the case of Eritrea, we have now a gender balance of on 100 women, you have only 93 men. In the central region, the imbalance is even worse. There are 100 women. On 100 women, you have only 85 men. This imbalance had been caused by the large-scale emigration of males in the age bracket from 18 to 45. About 80% of those 500,000 as Eritreans which fled abroad since 2002 are young men in this age category. This resulted in a shortage of marriageable men within Eritrea. Growingly, young women find it difficult to find suitable husbands. In 2016 in Sudan, I realized that young Muslim women from Zenhit, from the Ansaba region, who have never to fear to be called for national service, still migrate to Sudan because in their home villages they no longer have enough, there no longer are enough marriageable men. So they migrate to Sudan and marry then in Sudan the young men from their home villages who have emigrated there. One of the contested issue when dealing with Eritrea is the question how many people are actually living in Eritrea. In reports at international level, often figures are mentioned between 5 and 6 million people as Eritrean living in Eritrea. As no census had been taken, there are no really reliable baselines. However, the Eritrean government, since the early 90s, instructed the local administrations, the lowest level of the administrative structure in Eritrea, to maintain population registers. The data from the various local administrations are gathered at sub-SOBA and then at SOBA level, and then at the national level in the Ministry of Local Government. So in fact, due to these data, the Eritrean government has a very clear idea what the actual size of the Eritrean population is, but they never made any official pronouncement on this size. According to the data from the Ministry of Local Government, the Eritrean population in 2000, at the end of 2000, was 2.9 million. That accords very well with the calculated figure for the Eritrean resident population of 1993, which on the basis of the referendum figures which are available have been calculated to be something like 2.2 million, in the range of that. Now, with a population figure of 2.9 million in 2000 and a moderate population growth of 2% annually, the Eritrean population in 2016 would have been close to 4 million. This population growth figure of 2% appears to be reasonable based on various services undertaken by UNICEF and other international agencies in Eritrea. Despite the fact that some families still have a lot of children, many families have reduced the number of children, and also people tend to marry later. At the end of 2016, based on the figures from the Ministry of Local Government transmitted to the National Planning Ministry, the resident population in Eritrea was only 3.2%. So, in other words, there is a gap, a deficit of around 800,000 between the actual resident population and the resident population one should have expected based on the 2000 figures. This can be explained in two ways. One thing is, since 2002, around 500,000 Eritreans have fled abroad. So, secondly, 300,000 Eritrean children were not born because of this large number of refugees, and secondly, because the number of marriages and the number of children born in marriage has steeply declined within Eritrea due to the social effects of prolonged national service. With a residence population of only 3.2 million, it is clear that all the economic and social planning of the Eritrean government, based on much higher population projections, have been rendered useless. The Eritrean labor force is much smaller than calculated, and that also has effects also on the productivity of the economy and in many other areas. Even worse, when one looks at the details of the Eritrean population, one finds very disturbing trends. At the end of 2016, the Eritrean Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs conducted, with international financial and technical support, an Eritrean labor force survey. It took the survey team 2 years to finalize the report, but this report was never published. I strongly believe that the report was not published because the findings of this report are very disturbing. One thing, it shows that the Eritrean population, as mentioned before, is much smaller than everyone believed and the Eritrean authorities officially pretended. Secondly, the social data contained in the survey indicate that the Eritrean as a society has been deeply skewed by the impact of the migration abroad and also internal migrations. When one looks at the regional population growth based on the SOBAs, the comparison between the figure of 2000 and 2016 indicates that some SOBAs actually have lost population. Some SOBAs had a population growth more or less in line with the average national population growth of 20%. And one SOBA has a very high population growth, far above the national average. The census or the data of the National Population Register from the Ministry of Local Affairs, local government, indicates that at the end of 2016, the urbanization rate in Eritrea was about 30%. Contrary to the perception of most Eritreans that Eritrea is a highly urbanized society, the urbanization rate in Eritrea with 30% is below the urbanization rate of many other African states of comparable size and development. Within the urban areas, the gender imparity is quite marked. You have 45% as a male and 55% female. The data also indicate that among the households of Eritrea, due to the emigration of males, nearly 40% of the households in Eritrea currently are female-headed households, which is one of the highest incidences of female-headed households in Africa, which has a serious social and economic implications. Female-headed households generally are economically weaker than the complete households where you have a couple, complete family unit. The women have more difficulties getting a full-time employment. They have only employment in areas where they earn less than men. So the household income is much lower than if there would be a man wage earner in the family, which results that the children of this family have less chances of economic support in their education. Also, the age structure is skewed. In the age group of 18 to 45, the percentage of this age group in the overall population is markedly less than in comparable neighboring states due to the emigration of these people abroad. Also, even in the younger generations, the share of children between the age of 0 to 14 is much lower than one would expect because of the depression of the marriage rate and the number of children born due to the negative effect of national service. This age category is much lower, which will result also in a reduced population growth in the coming years when these smaller generations enter into the reproductive stage. Another area where there is a major impact of emigration on social structure is that currently in Eritrea you have about 20% of the children up to the age of 17 are not living with one or both parents, but they are living in foster arrangements, most of them as relatives. That indicates that their biological parents, one parent or two, have fled abroad. What that means for a society when a full 20% of the young generation is growing up in unstable social settings, even as these children are living with relatives, they do not have the same social security in this arrangement than biological children of their foster parents. They are always a little bit strangers within this family context where they are living. That has major implications for the development of healthy social personalities, integrated social personalities, which would become stable, mentally stable and socially stable adults. So this is, even if the emigration would stop now, if the parents would return, this will be a legacy for the Eritrean society for the decades to come. Another area where great uncertainty exists and also some misconceptions is the national service in Eritrea. The national service in Eritrea, it is not in this sense comparable with compulsory military service. It is national service because the recruits drafted into the national service not only serve in the military, but they also serve in development activities and in the civil service, in civilian jobs basically for the government, but under military discipline and under military code of conduct. And therefore the national service in Eritrea can neither be compared, let's say, for example, as a military service in Switzerland or military service as it used to exist in Germany. Originally, the national service was conceived to train those Eritreans who did not participate in the national liberation struggle against Ethiopia as fighters of the EPLF. To train these also in the use of arms and to expose them to a certain degree to the same kind of experience of hardship and camaraderie as the EPLF fighters experienced. Therefore, the first to be recruited into the national service were actually people quite above the age of 18. However, national service also should train, expose the new generations of Eritreans reaching adulthood into a similar experience the EPLF fighters had while they were fighting for the Eritrean liberation. However, this concept was never really implemented, and the way it was implemented, it never achieved its goals. It simply is a difference whether you are fighting in Sahel for the national liberation and your own survival, or whether you are serving in a regular army, in a training situation, in a situation where there is no war, where the people would have feeling no compulsion whatsoever to accept the kind of hardship and sacrifice imposed on them in the harsh training. So most of the national service recruits therefore only grudgingly went to the national service, endured the national service. Also, contrary to the intention, national service could never be universally implemented. When one looks at the figures between 1994, when the first round of the national service was called up, and 2002, when the 16th round had just been called up, only 275,000 national service recruits actually had been called up for active national service. That is far less than the number of the Eritreans between the age of 18 and 45 who had not served, who have not fought in the National Liberation War, or had reached adulthood, the age of 18, after the 91. So a large number of people who theoretically would have been obliged to render national service were never called up. One large group which was totally left out were Muslim women. The strong resistance of the Muslim community against the universal compulsory national service for Muslim girls forced the EPLF to tacitly grant the Muslim women a general dispensation exemption from national service. In all the rounds since 1994, less than 200 women from the Muslim community participated, and most of those came from urban areas, and many of those actually came as volunteers, which meant that roughly 1/4 of the potential recruits to national service were never called up. Also in the first years before 1998, Christian women were given fairly generous exemptions from national service. If they could prove to the authorities that they had to look after elderly family members, parents, or even uncles and aunts, they could stay at home. If they were in education, they were left in peace, they were not called up for national service. If they had some minor medical ills, the medical board granting medical exceptions usually was very generous for girls. So the main brunt of national service was actually carried by male Christian and Muslim. So overall figures naturally changed. The rate of recruitment stepped up during the Eritrean and Ethiopian War of 98-2000. But even then, recruitment was never as universal as people believed and the opponents of the Eritrean government abroad proclaimed. At the height of the fighting in May 2000, the largest round ever as a drafted international service numbered as 33,000, which was only maybe 60% of the age cohort at that time, reaching 18 in this year. So the discrepancy between the claim that national service is universal and the actual figures had a lot to do with that not everyone in the age group is fit for military service, had to do with exemptions granted for various reasons, social, medical, or even there was a certain element of social corruption, that people managed to get away from the national service because they knew someone in the recruitment office and other things, but also practical constraints one needs training places, one needs housing, one needs clothes, one needs to pay for it. So economically, the number of people trained in the national service was limited by the lack of funds of the Eritrean government. Actually, when one look at based on information from the National Bank of Eritrea obtained during visits in the 2000s, it seems that the Eritrean government basically financed the national service by taking loans from the national bank, not from its own tax income. The tax income of the Eritrean government would not allow the Eritrean government to finance the ambitious national service scheme, even with the low salaries given to the national service recruits and only the basic living costs. I did some calculation. If a national service recruit in the early 2000s got 600 nakfa per month, with the average size of people in national service of 300,000, you arrive at a staggering a yearly bill for salaries, more than 2 billion nakfa, and you can double this figure, the cost for housing, clothes, the transport, etc. And with the weak economic base of the Eritrean government, this bill they simply could not face from their own resources, so they had to take loans from the National Bank, and also that limited actually their intake. In 1995, the Eritrean military had been reduced to 45,000 professional military. And you had the biannual call-ups for national service training, and after the 18 months, each round was sent back to civilian life, but they remained part of the National Reserve Army. That means they had certain limitations on their free movement was imposed on them if they wanted to travel abroad. Those people who had finished their active national service, they still needed permission from the military authorities because they were still members of the National Reserve Army, and they could be called back to national service, not necessarily military service, but national service for the government, whenever the government saw a necessity for doing so. When the war started with Ethiopia in May 1998, 45,000 formerly demobilized EPLF fighters were recalled to service. All the national service rounds, 1 to 4 or 5, which had been passed through the national service and then as a return to civilian life, were recalled to service. And a few weeks after the start of the war, the Eritrean government announced that the time limitation on active national service of 18 months is unlimited, suspended due to the state of emergency, the state of war existing between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Since that time, there has not been any regular discharge from national service after 18 months. During the war, the Eritrean military forces, practically every national service recruit was sent to the military. The Eritrean military forces numbered between 300,000 and 350,000, out of which 23,000 died in the war. The casualty rate of the Eritrean army with 23,000 was also markedly lower than the casualty rate of the Ethiopian army, which was due to the far better frontline emergency medical services in the Eritrean army. The Eritrean army had inherited from the days of the liberation struggle. Most of the deaths of the Ethiopians actually occurred when wounded were transported from the front line to the hospitals and they died on the way. In the case of Eritrea, the death rate was much lower in this regard. As a result of that, the Ethiopian army had around 70,000 dead, but only 20,000 handicapped, whereas the Eritreans had 23,000 at the death from 97 to 2003 actually. And they had a much higher rate of handicapped, of 50,000 due to the war. So after the war, everyone expected that soon there would be a massive demobilization to bring back the national service to the mandatory 18 months and to reduce again the size of the Eritrean army as maybe as a 45,000 as before the war, but as a well below 100,000. All these hopes and expectations were not fulfilled. The state of emergency was not lifted. The unlimited extension of national service exists still today. However, from 2000 to 2005, there was an internationally funded demobilization program under our organization called Isayas, under which around 105,000 other soldiers were demobilized, and 40,000 of them were the surviving former EPLF fighters which had been remobilized in 98. Also, the major part of the other 65,000 who were demobilized were elderly, handicapped, and women soldiers. In other words, the Eritrean, the military and government used the internationally financed demobilization as an exercise to get rid of its deadwood people which they would have had to phase out of the national active service anyhow. After 2005, there no longer was any organized regular mass discharge of national service recruits. However, there was, particularly in the years 2005 to 2008, a fairly large number of individual discharges from active national service based on medical grounds. The medical board in this period, was very generous in granting medical dispensation. Some people got discharged on medical grounds from active national service having as a foot fungus. So rather than treating that and keeping them in service, but even the application of these medical discharges was rather haphazardly, was never done in a very organized way, and it depended on sheer luck. Also, if you had a good interaction with the responsible medical doctors, you had better chances to be discharged. You needed to be, if you want to get a medical discharge, your commanding officer had to submit your name to the medical board, and that meant basically if your commanding officer had a grudge against you, you never made it to the medical board, even if you are half dead and half blind or deaf. But others who were in favor with their commanding officers, they could make their way to the medical board and even get a discharge. So based on the information collected inside Eritrea from 2001 to 2009, it appears that roughly 100,000 participants in the national service, many of them also in active military service, but others also being in civilian works for the government as part of the national service, were discharged on an individual basis. Another roughly 100,000 members of the national service in the military aspect or the civilian aspect self-discharged by going absent without leave within the country or fleeing abroad. Naturally, there are no reliable figures, but from the arrival statistics in Sudan and in Eritrea, one can infer that about at least 20% of those people crossing to Sudan and Ethiopia, it's roughly 500,000, that about 20% of them came from active national service. Among those discharged on an individual basis, since 2007 were a growing number of women. It appears also that was never officially stated that since 2007 the Eritrean government began to implement a policy to discharge women from active national service once they reached the age of 27. That was explained to me that the Eritrean government did so because it wanted these women to marry and start a family life and to have children, to create the next generation of Eritreans and also the next generation of recruits for the national service. Another major change was also in 2003. In 2003 it was decided to introduce the 12th grade in the educational system, and that the graduates from 11th grade would have to take the 12th grade centrally in the Sawa military training camp as part of the national service. This decision started the militarization of higher education. Those graduates from the 11th grade were sent to Sawa, where before they started the academic education in the 12th grade, they underwent the basic military training of some weeks. During the academic training, they had the parallel military exercises, and after the national examination, at the end of the 12th grade in March, they had another 3 months of military training before they were discharged from Sawa in a graduation ceremony, but not from the discharge did not mean that with this graduation ceremony they were discharged from the active national service. It simply meant the end of the training and educational period, and afterwards they were distributed either to the colleges or to vocational training centers or to the military units or to positions in the civil service, depending on the points they had achieved during the examination, the national examination at the end of the 12th grade. But they continued to be in national service. Outside of those people sent to Sawa for the 12th grade, the military authorities continued to recruit people outside of the educational system, young Eritreans who had left the school system at various stages in their youth. They were called up for national service, but recruitment was not general and universal. According to the information available, it appears that the local administration were given quotas, that each local administration had to provide a certain number of national recruits, and it was left to the local administrations whom they are going to send to the national service. In the rural areas, when time came to fill the quota, often military units surrounded the villages to prevent people selected for national service When the EPLF took over the government in Eritrea in 1991, one of their proclaimed aims was to make Eritrea an educated society, to free the Eritrean population from the shackles of illiteracy and lack of education, and to tremendously expand the educational system. The war with Ethiopia in 1998-2000 interrupted and curtailed the educational activities of the Eritrean government. And in the post-war period, they needed to restructure the whole system. And in 2006, they published an educational plan for the next decade, where they outlined their goals for the education system. According to this plan, the number of students in the 12th grade in Sawa should rise in 2006 to 21,000 and in 2014-15 to 49,000. Out of those, for tertiary education, in 2006-7, 5,400 should go from the Sawa graduates to tertiary education. In 2014-2015, from the 49,000, roughly 50,000 expected, 18,000 should go to tertiary education. Roughly 25 to 30% of those graduates from Sawa were meant to go for further tertiary education. It was planned that the total number of students in tertiary education in 2006-2007 would be 16,000 and in 2014-15, 52,000. These figures were partly based on population figures which were far above the real population in Eritrea. It seems that the planners in the Ministry of Education were using population figures based on the rough guesstimates, and they were actually not using the figures of the Ministry of Local Government. There also was a lack of coordination between the different ministries. If one looks at the reality after 2006, it becomes apparent that none of these ambitious goals have been met. In the educational system in Eritrea, there are the two important examinations, or three important examinations. One is a national examination at the end of the 8th grade. Those students sitting for the 8th grade national examination are also registered with the national office, with the Office of National Service in the Prime Minister, in the President's office in Asmara. So it is the first registration of people for future national service. And it is a kind of bottleneck. The formal successful completion of the national examination at the end of 8th grade is a precondition to continue with secondary school education. Then you have the examination at the end of the 11th grade, which used to be conducted as a national examination until 2002. But after the introduction of 12th grade in Sawa, there is only the graduation at the 11th grade not conducted as a national examination. At the end of 12th grade, you have a national examination conducted for all 12th graders. In addition to those taking the 12th grade in Sawa, there are two Eritrean community schools in Saudi Arabia, where the students also take the national 12th grade examination. And there were two private schools in Asmara, which were allowed also to give 12th grade education, and their students took the 12th grade examination at the same time as the 12th graders in Sawa. There were also a few vocational training schools where parallel to the vocational training, students could also take the academic education up to the 12th grade. But taking all together, the Eritreans in Saudi Arabia, the students there, the students in vocational training school and in the international schools in Asmara, were only a tiny fraction of those taking the examination in Sawa. Now the interesting thing is, when looking at the figures for the national examination at the end of the 8th grade, one realizes an interesting fact. 2008-2009, the number of students sitting for the 8th grade examination was 45,000. This figure rose to 65,000 2011-12 in the school year 2011-12. One would have expected that in the coming year the figure of students taking the 8th grade as an examination would increase to above 70,000. However, contrary to these expectations, the number actually declined rapidly, and in 2016-17 it was back to 48,000, more than 20,000 less than one should have expected. It was not easy to find out what caused this decline, and it seems that a growing number of families took out their children before they completed 8th grade to avoid registration, the first registration in the Office of National Service. A growing number of families also took out their children from school for economic reasons, because they no longer could afford to pay for the education of their children, and they needed their children to do as a minor works to increase the family income. And also an increasing number of families sent out their children out of Ethiopia and joined the refugee living in the camps in Ethiopia and in Sudan. Another factor which contributed to this decline is the fact that due to the depression of population growth through flight, migration to abroad, the decline of marriage and the decline of children being born, the younger generations of Eritreans were numerically less large than the previous ones. So there was probably an actual decline in the age cohorts entering into the primary education and then finally taking the 8th grade examination. This also had major impact further down the line, with at very best stagnant figures of 8th graders successfully passing the national examination. The number of students entering into the higher levels of secondary education and making it to the 11th grade also tended to stagnate or to decline, which also meant that the number of students going to 12th grade in Sawa fell far behind the projections. Looking at the figures in Sawa, the first round in Sawa in 2002-2003 were only 5,000 students. That increased to a height of 17,000 in 2010-11, and over the next years the figures vacillated between 10,000 and 17,000. A far cry from the number projected in the educational plan of 2006. That also meant that the number of students going for tertiary education fell far behind the projections. One can say that roughly 1/3 of those taking the national examination at the end of 12th grade achieved the points to go qualify for tertiary education. From year to year there was a certain variation in the percentage, but roughly on average around 1/3 of those 30 to 35% managed to make it to the colleges. Interestingly, over time, the share of women who successfully managed to, in the national examination, to achieve the necessary points for higher tertiary education, the share of women constantly increased. And in the last rounds, a majority of the successful graduates were women. Obviously, the women could make better use of SAWA for various reasons. First of all, they generally worked more diligently. They were less distracted by other things. Also, the female students in SAWA are less frequent called up for parallel military or other tasks, training or other communal tasks, yeah? So they can concentrate better on their studies. About 1/3 of those in SAWA failed to achieve points to qualify them for any kind of further education. The middle range was sent for vocational training in the SAWA National Vocational Training Center, and the lower third, which did not qualify in any way, were either the men were usually sent to the military units, and the women were sent to administrative tasks in the head offices of the army or in various governmental offices, where they worked as a kind of educated gophers, administrative assistants, but they were not discharged as from national service. As a net result of this development, a further negative impact on the education system had the fact that a certain percentage of students in the 11th grade fled Eritrea before they took the final examination at the end of the 11th grade in order to escape being sent to SAWA. Also, a certain number of recruits taking the 12th grade in SAWA fled from SAWA before they completed 12th grade. From those sent to the colleges and to the National Vocational Training Center, a certain share, 15 to 20%, fled these institutions before the completion of their studies and went abroad. From those who completed their studies, it is estimated that about 50% of those who graduated from the colleges with a degree, a diploma, or a certificate have by now left Eritrea, which meant that the Eritrean government, which was banking on these colleges to produce the dearly needed qualified labor force, utterly failed in its goal. Instead of getting a growing number of academically trained professionals which could be employed in the government service in the various development projects, the Eritrean government is now faced with a situation that actually the pool of qualified professionals is shrinking. So many teachers have left Eritrea that the graduates from the colleges have to be employed as substitutes for secondary teachers which have fled abroad, which means these graduates are employed outside of their professional fields, and as such their education is wasted and they cannot be used for the economic development of Eritrea. So if this negative trend continues and there is no sign that it abates, that it will change for the better, Eritrea is facing a manpower crisis, a labor force crisis, particularly in the field of trained professionals, which will hamstring, curtail the economic developments of Eritrea for the coming decades.
Finally, he gave an in-depth presentation on the Eritrean population, the National Service Program, and the Eritrean education system. The presentation is primarily based upon the evaluation of the sent data obtainable from official Eritrean sources, most of them not accessible in the public domain, and on additional information gathered from numerous Eritreans over the 2 decades in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Europe, and North America. We appreciate that Guenter took the time to share his knowledge and insights with us for the benefit of the Eritrean community and anyone interested in Eritrea.